Why do we study the Greeks? Almost everybody knows that the ancient Greeks contributed to Western civilization. Almost everybody knows something about the ancient Greeks. But why really do we study them? We can begin by answering the question this way. If we want to know who we are as a people, as a culture, as a nation, if we want to know why we think the way we do, why we have the categories of thought that we do, the logic that we do, why we think about the world and ask the sorts of questions that we do, then we need to know our history, and our history includes the ancient Greeks. A broad overview of Western civilization would almost always begin with the Greeks, because the Greeks first began asking and answering questions in a way that we still follow, that we still imitate. We don't think like the ancient Indians or Persians or Chinese or South Americans. We think like the Greeks in many ways. Now, of course, the ancient Greek culture and their ways of thought that have influenced us have been mediated through the Romans and especially through Christianity. But God in His providence established our culture such that it began with the Greeks, and we want to look at them and see why, see how they've accounted for our ways of thinking, and see what the Greeks have done that have contributed to our styles of art and architecture and law and politics and even medical practice and literature and so on. And so we look at the Greeks because they're part of our culture, or they're part of the heritage, the history of our culture, and they're far more important than most people think. We look at certain aspects of the Greek world in particular. There are things about the Greeks that were not influential. For example, in early American culture, the Greeks were not as highly prized among the colonists, the well-educated colonists and the founding fathers, as the Romans were. And when the founding fathers of our country set out to come up with a new form of government for the U.S., they specifically and consciously did not imitate the Greeks. The Greeks were particularly bad about their civil life and their social life. A fractious, contentious people, warring all the time, never really getting along. But they were very, very good at some things, at the imaginative life, at philosophy, at thinking about the big questions, about art and literature and probing the nature of man. And so when we study the Greeks, what we will do in this course is what I think everybody should do if they want to be well-educated and have a knowledge of the Greeks, and that is talk about the Greek literature, which means, of course, primarily Homer at the beginning, the great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which set out for us the first model of imagination and imaginative literature. Our Western imagination has been heavily influenced by the Iliad and the Odyssey. We want to also read and study and think about the Greek dramas, because the Greek dramas do the same sort of thing, but from a different angle. They explore human nature and why we think the way we do, and why especially we fail the way we do, and ask whether there's any solution. We want to talk about the Greek historians, because the Greek historians, Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon, set the model for later history, all later history. And we want to talk about Greek philosophy especially. Plato and Aristotle and some of the other philosophers were the first to really ask the questions in a philosophical manner that we still think about and still ask and try and answer. And whether we as Christians answer the questions in the same way, the Greeks taught us how to ask, how to pursue, and how to think about them. And the Greeks providentially gave us many categories of thought which later Christians could use for their own purposes in formulating Christian doctrine, in developing theology, and refuting heresy, and understanding the Scripture. So the Greeks are tremendously important in at least those four ways: literature, especially the epics, drama and theater, history, and philosophy. And of course, the Greeks wrote a lot of other things too. They wrote about mathematics and geometry, and they wrote about medicine and the human body. But those four areas that I mentioned are some of the most important areas. And so in our course, we'll be talking about Homer and his great epics, the historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, and their exploration of how the narrative of history looks and what we can learn from it. And we'll be talking about the dramas, where they really plunge deeply into the mystery of human nature and why, when we seem to be so great and so capable, we fail so miserably and fall to such depths. And we'll talk about philosophy. And we'll learn from Plato and Aristotle how to think about things like what is the nature of man, what is the nature of the transcendent that we all long for and have a feeling about, what is the good, what is virtue and vice, how do we discipline our souls, and so on. So the Greeks give us questions. They give us some answers, and whether the answers are the right ones or not, they show us how to question and how to answer. The Greeks teach us how to think about stories in their imaginative literature. And along the way, we'll talk about some of the other things, too, that I mentioned, the architecture that the ancient Greeks have given us that still shows up in great capitol buildings and so on. We'll talk about how the medicine, the medical thought of the Greeks has affected modern times, and even down to the modern debate over abortion and the Hippocratic oath that doctors up until recently always took. We'll talk a little bit about the mathematics and the geometry that the Greeks wrote about and thought about as well. But primarily we'll talk about their view of philosophy, history, and literature.